In the previous video, we created a repository on GitHub, created some files locally, and pushed our files up onto GitHub. We then went ahead and deleted our local files, which was representative of deleting a project, and then went ahead and pulled all of the files back from GitHub, so that we could continue working on the project. This is the workflow that most GitHub users will actually use during their day-to-day use of GitHub. But we did go through it quite quickly in the previous video. And so in this video I'm going to go through the exact same process, but at a slower pace, and explaining what I'm doing and some of the technical phrases I use in more detail. So the first thing that I mentioned was the fact that we have a GitHub server and our local computer. The GitHub servers are referred to as the remote, while the local computer is referred to as local. There are reasons for this, which we'll discuss in a lot of detail later on, but the biggest of which is the fact that when we're working on websites, for example, we may not necessarily push to the GitHub server. We may want to push to actually deploy our updates into a working environment. And so the phrases remote and local are very specific to what they actually mean, meaning the GitHub server and our local computer. We then talked about how we push things up to the GitHub server and pull them down from the GitHub server. Push and pull are obviously very specific in what they mean. Push being always from local to remote, or to some other destination, and pull being from remote to local. You should try to think about these terms in the sense of you are pushing from wherever you are to somewhere else, and you're pulling from somewhere else to where you are. And this is because it is possible to pull from remote, which is used mainly if you're doing maintenance on the remote server. Now, apart from pulling directly between computers, we actually put the files in specific places, specifically the workspace. If you're working in Eclipse, for example, in a Java project, you'll be familiar with the idea of workspaces. If you're using PHP to develop a website, for example, this is simply the folder which contains all of your actual projects. So depending on your operating system, it may be the htdocs folder or the var www folder. Every time you pull data from the remote server, it's always placed in this local workspace. We then have a staging area. Despite what it might seem like, GitHub doesn't actually upload every single file every single time you make a change to it. It doesn't even upload the entire file that you've made changes to. All it does is keep a track of what the changes are and uploads those changes. Monitoring what these changes are all takes place in what's called the staging area. This is often a file within the workspace of your local machine, which actually tracks what the changes are that you're making to files. And so, as mentioned, changes from the workspace are recorded in the staging area. And at this point you can see that we have the majority of this workflow completed. We do of course have multiple repositories that we can create on our GitHub remote server. And so by accounting for the fact that we can have multiple repositories, we do complete the cycle of what happens within Git. So now that we know the rough workflow of what happens within Git, we can go through the process again and actually understand what's going on at each specific point. So the first thing that we did was to create a repository. If we create a GitHub test repository again, we can see that this is basically just creating a new folder. This won't show up directly on GitHub straight away because we haven't pushed this to the server yet, and so the server doesn't know that this exists. But you can see that each of these repositories represents an individual folder. The next thing that we did was to go ahead and create a file, which was a readme file. And we added some text in here. And saved it, which then appeared in the uncommitted changes within our GitHub client. We can of course have multiple lines, which in this example will help us demonstrate what's happening a lot more clearly. So now we can see we have these 3 lines. If we save this as an initial readme file and commit this, we can select this file, which is the staging of the file, and commit it to the master. So now we know that we have this file in our repository, we can go ahead and make some changes to it. So let's change this line to say something else and save it. If we look in uncommitted changes now, we can see that this line has been deleted, which did say some more, and this line has been added, which says something else. This section, which is coloured, is actually called a diff, or a differential, and this is what's actually uploaded to GitHub. It's simply the differences within the files, rather than the entirety of the file. So we can go ahead and commit this as well. You would obviously normally think of a better name than that, but we can commit that. And now we have our initial file which is going to be uploaded, plus the differential for this change. We can't actually see it, but now that we have this new file and this differential in our staged area, we can go ahead and push this information up onto our remote server, which is the GitHub server in this case. And within the GitHub client, as we did previously, this is called publish repository. Once this repository is published, we can of course continue to make more changes. So let's change this 3rd line to something else. The GitHub client obviously picks this change up, and we can add a commit to this. But this time you can see that something else, which was the previous line that we changed, isn't highlighted in any colour, because that was the current state of the file before this change. You obviously wouldn't normally commit changes on such a regular basis. You would instead make commits whenever a piece of functionality is a step closer to being completed. But for now we'll just use single lines. And now you can see at the top right we have sync plus this +1, because we've made one change which is not recorded on our remote server, and so we can upload our change again. And as you can see, that new addition has been added onto our history. If we go across to our browser and refresh our page, and we go to our GitHub test, we can see that we now have 4 commits which represent each of the changes that we've made. As I mentioned previously, each of these commits is basically a copy of the entire project at that specific point in time. And so you could of course click each of these buttons, which will show you the repository at that specific point in time. So you can see here that our changes to these 2 lines haven't been implemented yet. But if we go back and look at our repository at this point, we can see that they have been. The next thing we did in our previous video was to delete our local copy of the repository. So let's go ahead and do that. We can delete this from here, and we can also delete all of the contents of this folder. So to pull our project back from the server into our local path, we can select clone from our options, select the repository that we want to clone, and click clone, and this will go ahead and download all of the files again. And we have our project back in the exact same state we had it originally. In this video we've talked about the workflow involved with typical usage of GitHub, which involves committing changes as well as pushing changes to this remote server and pulling them again locally. In the next video we're going to talk about branches, which are a really powerful function of GitHub and Git in general, which allows different people to work on the same project at the same time in a collaborative way. So make sure you subscribe so that you don't miss that.